They were maintenance men, technicians, and chefs, people who trusted the systems built to keep them safe. But when pressure mounts, metal breaks, and timing falters, even ordinary places can collapse in seconds. These are the moments when work itself became the point of no return. It was March 22, 2017, at a theme park near Yamanashi, Japan. The air was still cool, and the sun had barely started to rise over the snow-tipped mountains in the distance. Inside the park, the first workers of the day moved in steady patterns, carrying tool bags, testing switches, and checking gates before visitors arrived. The ride stood quiet and empty, their massive steel tracks and support beams stretching high into the pale morning sky. Among the crew was Kenji Sato, age 42, a maintenance worker who had been with the park for nearly 15 years. He was known for being thorough and always checking bolts and track joints by hand, pressing his fingers along metal seams to feel for the smallest looseness. This morning, he followed the same routine, moving through the restricted service zone with a small flashlight tucked beneath his arm. His reflective vest caught bits of the dim light as he stepped carefully under the structure of the park's main roller coaster. At around 6:40 in the morning, Kenji crouched in the trench beneath one section of the elevated track. He leaned close to inspect a joint, tapping it with a wrench and shining his light along the seam. At the same time, in the operator's booth, another team was preparing for the day's test run. These early test runs were routine, meant to confirm that the trains moved smoothly before the first guests were allowed on. Communication lines were open, but in the half-dark of early morning, Kenji's position beneath the track was not visible from the booth. Several co-workers standing near the platform later said they caught a glimpse of his reflective vest between the beams. One of them called out, but the test had already been set in motion. The train's brakes released, and the cars began to roll forward with a metallic clatter. The sound grew louder as the train picked up speed, the wheels grinding along the rails toward the section where Kenji was crouched. By the time he turned his head upward, the cars were almost on top of him, and the train gathered enough force to strike him head-on and throw his body against the concrete trench wall. Witnesses described hearing a heavy impact that sent a jolt through the trench, the sound carrying beneath the track as the weight of the cars thundered overhead. A co-worker shouted, but the train could not be stopped in time. The cars continued along the circuit, the rest of the crew frozen in shock as the noise faded into the distance. When the train rolled to a halt, the ride sat in eerie silence. The operator cut power, leaving the cars suspended in place on the track above. Workers rushed into the restricted zone, but there was nothing left to do. The trench where Kenji had been crouching was now quiet, only the faint hum of the ride's machinery still audible. For several minutes, no one spoke. The crew stood in disbelief, staring at the stopped train and the empty seats. The sounds of the park, the usual chatter of radios, the clank of tools, the hum of generators, had gone still. By late morning, the decision was made to close the entire park. Gates that had been prepared to welcome visitors were quietly shut. Tourists arriving from buses were turned away without explanation, watching from the parking lot as the rides loomed in silence behind the fences. Inside, security staff sealed off the roller coaster and the surrounding pathways. By noon, the park stood empty, the sounds of laughter and movement replaced with the stillness of steel tracks against the mountain air. It was October 6th, 2014, at a medical center in Manhattan. The imaging department was working through a crowded schedule, with late appointments pushing into the evening. The hallways carried the usual hospital sounds: footsteps on tile, rolling carts, and the beeping of machines. In the MRI wing, technicians prepared the scanning room for the next patient. The large machine dominated the space, its bore open like a tunnel waiting for the next person to be slid inside. Among the staff was Angela Ramsey, 29 years old, a nurse's aide. She had joined the hospital a year earlier and often covered multiple support roles. That afternoon, she was helping the imaging staff with patient preparation. Angela's job was simple: guide the patient in, check the safety checklist, and bring in whatever support equipment was needed. On this day, The patient assigned to her required a portable oxygen tank. These tanks were heavy, steel cylinders fitted with gauges and a valve at the top. They were not supposed to enter the MRI room because the magnetic field could pull them in. But according to co-workers, the tank was rolled in without being flagged, a mistake that bypassed the usual safety check. Around 7:15 in the evening, Angela walked into the scanning room, holding onto the cylinder. The patient remained outside in the prep area, waiting for the machine to be cleared. A technician was at the control station, adjusting settings, while another staff member looked through paperwork. Eyewitnesses later described what happened as almost instant. The moment the tank crossed the threshold of the room, the powerful magnet seized it. The cylinder ripped free from Angela's hands, as though yanked by an invisible rope. Workers nearby said it shot forward so fast that there was no time to react. The heavy tank slammed across the room in a blur of steel. In less than a second, it pinned Angela against the side of the MRI bore with crushing force. The sound of metal striking metal rang through the chamber, followed by shouts from the startled technicians. One staff member lunged for the emergency shutoff, but the magnet held at full strength. The tank stayed fused to the bore, pressed hard against the machine with Angela trapped between. Those in the room later recalled the noise of the gauges rattling on the tank and the steady hum of the magnet still powering the scanner. Technicians tried pulling at the tank, but the pull of the field was far too strong. Angela's body slumped under the weight, and the cylinder stayed fused against the machine like it had been welded there. From the hallway outside, patients waiting for their scans heard shouting and the sudden thud of equipment. Staff quickly moved them back into the lobby. Orderlies shut the double doors and placed tape across the entryway to keep anyone from walking in. The imaging wing grew quiet, except for the muffled hum of the magnet still running inside the sealed room. Within an hour, the corridor was empty, sealed off with security standing by. The only sound was the ventilation system pushing cool air through the deserted hallway. Behind the closed door, the MRI sat silent, except for its constant low vibration. By late evening, the entire wing was cordoned off. Security staff redirected anyone who approached, offering no explanations. The hospital floors above remained active with their normal traffic, but the MRI unit below stayed dark. Inside the chamber, the machine and the oxygen tank remained locked together, an immovable reminder of what had taken place just hours earlier. It was January 4th, 2019, at a hotel in Dubai. The main kitchen was at full pace, preparing for a banquet dinner that evening. The event was important. A visiting trade delegation had reserved one of the hotel's ballrooms, and the staff had been working since the morning to keep everything on schedule. Stainless steel counters were lined with trays of vegetables, fish, and meats. Saucepans steamed on burners, and the constant noise of knives on cutting boards mixed with the clatter of dishes being stacked and carried away. Among the staff was Farid Hassan, 38 years old, a sous chef with 2 decades of kitchen experience. He had been working in hotels and restaurants since the age of 17. That afternoon, he was stationed near the hot line, making sure prep stations were clean and ingredients stayed organized. At one point, he crouched near the grease trap beneath the grated floor, where oils and runoff collected. A co-worker nearby later recalled that Farid was chatting casually about their children as he worked, his hands moving through a routine he had done countless times. By 6:30 in the evening, the kitchen was at its busiest. Multiple burners ran at once, deep fryers bubbled, and waiters hurried in and out to pick up trays. The heat inside the room was thick, and the air carried the smell of frying oil and roasted meat. It was during this rush that a small spill of oil leaked through the grate, dripping into the trap below. Farid bent down with a flashlight to check, intending to wipe the mess before it spread further. At that moment, a flame from one of the nearby gas stoves made contact with the vapors rising from the oil. Witnesses said it happened almost instantly. A muffled whoomph echoed through the space, and a wall of fire exploded upward out of the pit. The flames shot toward the ceiling, catching the grease that had built up in the narrow space around the trap. The fire engulfed the space where Farid was crouched. Co-workers shouted as the flash of light filled the room, followed by the smell of burning oil. Some staff grabbed wet towels and tried to smother the flames, but the fire spread too fast. The ceiling vents above the cooking line quickly caught, and flames moved through the air ducts, pulling smoke across the kitchen. Automatic suppression nozzles discharged above the fryers, but the flash fire had already moved beyond their range. Within seconds, alarms triggered. A shrill siren rang through the kitchen and into the dining hall, startling waiters carrying trays toward the banquet doors. Smoke spread in thick layers, blurring the counters and turning the air gray. Staff scrambled for fire extinguishers, while others tried to guide workers toward the service exit. One dishwasher later described seeing sparks shoot across the ceiling before the lights dimmed under the smoke. By the time responders reached the lower level, most of the flames had burned out on their own, leaving scorched metal and shattered glass across the line. In the corner near the grate, they found Farid collapsed beside the grease trap. His reflective apron burned through. He had been only a few feet from the fire door, but never made it out. When the smoke finally cleared, the kitchen was silent. Steam rose from the soaked floors where sprinklers had run dry. Utensils, trays, and burned vegetables lay scattered under a haze that smelled of ash and oil. Farid's station, the one he had kept spotless for years, was barely recognizable. Outside, the dining hall reopened days later, but the lower kitchen never did. For those who had worked beside him, the space stayed frozen in memory, one quiet corner of a busy hotel that no one returned to. It was June 12, 2015, in Quezon City, Philippines. The church compound was quiet at that hour, but inside the candle factory, the work continued. Orders had doubled ahead of the annual festival, and the staff had been told to push through the night to meet demand. The building itself was simple: concrete walls, wooden beams overhead, and long work tables lined with tubs of melted wax. Rows of molds cooled near the windows, stacked waist-high and giving off the faint scent of paraffin. Around 24 workers moved between tables, dipping wicks, pouring wax, and trimming cooled batches. The sound of scraping metal molds and splashing wax filled the air, mixing with the steady hum of fans pushing warm air toward the doors. Despite the hour, the heat in the room was heavy, the floors slick with stray drips of hardened wax. Among the group was Marites Alonzo, 47 years old, known by the others as the batch leader. She had worked there for more than 10 years and often showed the younger workers how to pour and dip properly. On this night, she moved between groups, checking molds and reminding workers to keep the floor clear of spills. Witnesses later recalled seeing her with a rag tucked in her apron pocket, using it to wipe stray drips as she walked. At 1:15 in the morning, a container filled with melted paraffin was accidentally knocked from one of the tables. The hot liquid poured across the floor, spreading quickly in a thin sheet. Several workers shouted as it touched a patch of heat near the burners. In an instant, flames flashed upward, racing across the spill. Eyewitnesses said the fire leapt from tub to tub, igniting other containers like a chain reaction. The workers closest to the door bolted, while others grabbed tools or cloths to try and put out the flames. One man later told investigators the fire spread so fast, the wooden beams overhead began to blacken and shed embers as the fire spread. The air grew thick, carrying the sharp smell of burning wax. Marites was seen near the back of the factory, trying to guide younger staff toward the rear exit. But the fire had already reached that corner. Flames curled up the door frame, sealing off the only path out. Windows along the wall cracked under the heat, glass shattering outward into the courtyard. Smoke poured through the gaps, spilling into the compound. Neighbors living beside the church compound said they woke to the sound of shouts and breaking glass. From the street, they saw smoke rising through the dark sky, the glow of fire visible through the factory's high windows. Some ran to the gates, but the heat kept them back. They later recalled the sound of timber snapping as the roof beams gave way. Inside, the blaze consumed the rows of molds and tubs, turning them into fuel. The workers who escaped said they barely made it out through the side doors near the supply storage, their clothes marked with soot. Others had tried the main exit, but were forced back by flames and smoke so thick they couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. When the fire was finally out, responders searched the ruins. Marites was discovered near the rear exit, collapsed at the frame she had tried to reach, only feet from the way out. By morning, The smoke had settled over the compound, the smell of wax and ash lingering in the air long after the fire was gone. Authorities later sealed off the site for inspection, but the damage had already erased most traces of how it began. It was September 17, 2015, at a county medical examiner's facility outside Chicago. The morgue was busy even at night, with staff moving between storage rooms and logging case numbers into ledgers. The facility handled hundreds of bodies each month, and inventory checks were part of the routine to keep cases organized. Long hallways connected the autopsy rooms to the storage wing, where several large walk-in freezers held rows of gurneys stacked with covered remains. Among the night staff was Thomas Grady, 56 years old, a morgue attendant with more than 30 years in the job. He had worked nights for most of his career and was known for humming jazz tunes as he wrote in his logbook. Colleagues recalled that he never rushed his work, often double-checking tags before marking them down. That night, his task was to confirm identification numbers in the west freezer. Carrying a clipboard and pen, he stepped inside around 11:15 p.m. The freezer was large, cold, and brightly lit, its temperature set to about 37 degrees Fahrenheit. Shelves of gurneys filled the space, each one tagged with a paper slip tied to the wrist or ankle of the covered remains. Thomas walked steadily between them, his pen moving across the page as he checked numbers against his list. The steady hum of the refrigeration fans filled the room. Minutes after he entered, the heavy steel door swung shut. The latch clicked, sealing tight. From the outside, no one noticed. In the adjoining workroom, two attendants were busy sorting files. Later, they admitted they heard faint thuds, but assumed it was trays shifting or equipment being rolled. The insulated walls muffled nearly all sound from inside. Thomas continued his work at first, finishing several lines in the log. At some point, he realized the door wouldn't budge. The freezer's design only allowed it to be opened from the outside, and there was no alarm or emergency release in that unit. That particular model had been in service since the 1980s, one of the few that hadn't yet been refitted with an internal latch or safety alarm. His clipboard was left on a lower shelf when he paused, the pen resting across the page mid-sentence. By midnight, the cold had begun to seep deeper into the room. The metal shelving felt colder than the air itself, the chill biting through his gloves as he worked. He'd been on shift since noon, his body running on stale coffee and habit. He moved slower now, his hands stiff, his thoughts clouding as the chill settled through his clothes. At 2 a.m., the rest of the staff finished their assignments. One by one, they clocked out and left the building, assuming Thomas had already gone. The corridor outside the storage wing fell silent. Inside the chamber, the air stayed bright and faintly circulating, the low mechanical hum masking every sound. Hours passed without anyone noticing. The cold drew tighter around him, his movements slowing until they stopped entirely. Sometime before dawn, Thomas collapsed beside the shelving, the cold overtaking him long before anyone returned. At 6:45 a.m., the morning shift arrived. A younger attendant was sent to retrieve a body scheduled for release paperwork. He opened the freezer door and immediately saw Thomas lying on the floor near the shelving unit, his skin pale and his posture rigid. The clipboard was still on the rack above him, the final entry left unfinished. The workers shouted for help, and others rushed to the doorway. Supervisors moved in quickly, ordering the freezer sealed while emergency services were called. Paramedics arrived shortly after, but confirmed he had already been dead for several hours. He had died from hypothermia sometime before dawn. By late morning, the west freezer was closed off, and all storage was rerouted to another wing. Staff avoided the corridor where he had been found, the doorway taped shut while repairs were arranged. The incident later led to safety upgrades, adding internal release latches to all remaining storage units. On the counter outside, his logbook and pen remained untouched, the last line of handwriting trailing off without completion. It was April 9, 2016, at a private antiquities museum on the outskirts of Cairo. The sun had started heating the sandstone walls, and the air inside was still cool from the night before. Workers moved between rows of crates and stone fragments spread across 3 galleries and a restoration wing. The building was not large, but it held several artifacts recently moved from government storage facilities across the city. Among the newest arrivals was a granite sarcophagus, its lid weighing well over a ton. The staff had been preparing it for a new display scheduled to open later that month. Youssef Khalil was 34 and part of the small handling team assigned to move the heavy lid. He grew up in a neighborhood near Giza and studied history in college before taking the museum job 5 years earlier. He liked being around history, even if the work was mostly physical. The pay was steady and the hours were predictable. That morning, the team gathered in the lower gallery where the exhibit was being set up. Temporary scaffolding lined the walls and tools sat in open cases near the entrance. A steel winch stood anchored to the floor near the sarcophagus, its hook hanging at chest height. The lid had been placed in a wooden crate for transport, secured by heavy chains that connected to the winch. The plan was to lift it, move the base into position, then lower it carefully onto a reinforced pedestal built specifically for the display. Youssef arrived early that day, as he usually did. He checked the straps and made sure the chains were properly attached, while the others tested the hoist controls. The work was routine but required careful coordination. The team had handled smaller artifacts before, but this was the heaviest piece they had moved in months. The museum director had reminded them twice to take their time and follow procedures exactly. No shortcuts, no rushing. The morning moved slowly. Workers swept the floor around the installation area and adjusted the pedestal to the correct height. By 10:30 a.m., everything was ready. The winch motor hummed when they powered it on. The chain pulled tight and the granite slab began to rise slowly from its wooden base. Workers positioned themselves at the corners of the crate, hands ready to steady it as the lid lifted. The steel links creaked under the weight. Dust drifted down from the ceiling rafters as the machine took on the full load. The slab hovered several inches above the floor, swaying slightly. Witnesses later told investigators the chain snapped without any warning. The sound was sharp and metallic. The slab dropped straight down before anyone could react. Youssef had been standing near the corner, one hand reaching out to guide the crate as it swung. The granite struck him directly before he could step back. The impact threw him to the floor beneath the weight. The thud echoed through the gallery. One worker stumbled backward, hands still raised from holding the guide rope. Another shouted for help. Then 2 men rushed forward and grabbed at the broken chain still hanging from the hoist above. They tried to lift the granite slab, but it barely shifted under their combined effort. Someone ran to the wall to cut power to the winch, while others pulled phones from their pockets and called for security. The building had no central emergency system, no alarm to trigger, just individual radios and mobile phones. Within minutes, supervisors arrived from the restoration wing on the far side of the building. They radioed for paramedics and ordered everyone to block the hallway leading to the gallery. The small staff gathered near the doorway. The floor beneath the wooden crate was cracked in a wide spiderweb pattern where the slab had fallen. When emergency crews reached the site nearly 20 minutes later, they brought hydraulic air jacks from their truck. They positioned the jacks carefully and raised the granite just enough to pull Youssef free from underneath. There was nothing they could do. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause was listed as massive blunt trauma to the chest and head. Work stopped immediately across the entire museum. The lights in the lower gallery were switched off and the machinery powered down. The sound of the winch motor cooling was the only noise in the space. Staff were sent home for the rest of the day. Outside, tourists waiting for afternoon tours were told the exhibit was delayed due to a technical issue. Within the hour, the gates locked and police cordoned off the loading area. That evening, the museum released a statement citing an equipment malfunction during installation. Authorities conducted a brief safety inspection before the site reopened a week later. The sarcophagus exhibit was never completed. The artifact was quietly returned to storage. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now